Legend of Zelda is by far my favorite video game series, and so I suppose that it's only natural that I would have a copious amount of respect for the entries that established the series and led it to becoming what it became. But to be honest, it doesn't really go any further than just respect, because these three games are by far my least favorite games to go back to. And I already know that A Link to the Past stands are going to be sending hitmen my way to eliminate me off the face of the earth, but I just can't really gel with this game. Everything that it does has been done better in later games, which makes going back to this specific entry really boring. And saying that this isn't a fair reason to dislike the game is dumb, since not everyone who gets into the series will play this game first. I didn't. This was actually the last Zelda game I played before Breath of the Wild released, and it was underwhelming to say the least. Saying that it's only fair to judge the game at the time of its release is easily the stupidest thing I've ever heard in my life that has nothing to do with politics. That's like saying that Wind Waker's graphics are utterly terrible and they should never have done kitty cel-shaded base Zelda. But no, when you bring up Wind Waker, it apparently doesn't apply anymore, despite me judging it based solely on the criteria of the time it was released. As for my experience with the other games, Zelda 2 was the first 2D Zelda that I played, and it was the GBA version. And for the love of all that is good in this world, do not play the GBA version of this game, especially if it's a first playthrough. The screen crunch makes it even more brutal than it already is normally. Though if you want to find even more of a challenge in this game for whatever reason, then be my guest. Despite how frustrating the whole experience was, I eventually beat it, and the amount of serotonin I received that day has been unmatched by anything else in this life. How sad is that? But the frustration still wasn't worth it. For years after this playthrough, I'd considered a straight up bad game. However, an interesting thing that I discovered on my last playthrough was that there were pockets of greatness surrounding the questionable design choices. So despite still being my least favorite Zelda, I would no longer call it a bad game. Character development. And the original, I just kind of played. I don't really have any recollection of my first playthrough. This retrospective will differ slightly from my other Zelda videos, since the focus will be on how these three games evolved the series so that it could eventually soar with later games. There will still be a heavy reliance on my subjective viewpoint, since I hate trying to be quote-unquote objective, and it will ultimately have a major impact on my thoughts on how these games evolved the formula. With that said and done, let's get into this Legend of Zelda, The Adventure of Link, and A Link to the Past triple retrospective. If I had to mention how the visual style of the games progressed and evolved over time, I honestly wouldn't really be able to go in depth with it. I just don't have anything to really say about it. I will say that I'm not a big fan of how Link looks in the Overworld in the second game. He just looks way too squashed. And Link's pink hair in A Link to the Past caused me to be confused for so many years because his hair color was different in the game than in all of the promotional art. Anyway, the main problem I have when describing it is mainly just that the art style is the same between them all, and it's fine. Nothing bad, but it's far from my favorite in the series. What I can comment on is the music. The first game hardly has any music. There's a title screen theme, which does a great job at establishing the tone of the adventure. Then there's the Overworld theme, which is simplistic, however, hearing it on loop for what could potentially be upwards of 30 minutes, it still manages to somehow not get on my nerves. I never feel like it's too much, and of course it's one of the most iconic video game songs of all time, so there's really not much else to say. There's the dungeon theme, which isn't quite as good as the main theme, but it still manages to capture the dank atmosphere that the dungeons probably have. Then there's Death Mountain, which does a decent job at setting a foreboding sense of dread and evil throughout the dungeon, despite not being anything more than serviceable. But I think that my favorite theme in the game is the staff roll. Sure, I don't think it fits a Zelda game necessarily, but it's so catchy and it does a great job at making you feel accomplished after finally beating the game. Plus, having it go from the game over theme, which you'll probably be very acquainted with, to a fuller, more cheery theme is pretty cool and does give it a bit more cohesion with the rest of the game. Zelda 2 has a few more tracks than the first game, however I can't really say that the soundtrack in general comes anywhere close to the quality of the first game. The title screen theme starts out really cool, and it seems like it will nearly match the first game, but then it just goes in a direction that I'm not that big a fan of. I like the Overworld theme, it's nowhere near as good as the first game's, but I still think it's quite good. The rest of the soundtrack, on the other hand, I don't really like any of the other music in the game. The town theme is forgettable, the battle theme is just kinda there, and I just do not like the credits theme. There are, however, two themes that I love though, and are some of my favorites in the series. Those being the palace themes. The final dungeon is slightly better than Death Mountain's theme from the last game, and it's a suitable concluding track. But the main dungeon theme is one of my all-time favorites. Instead of focusing on a foreboding atmosphere, it goes all in on being a sweet action theme, and it is simply fantastic. It might even be my favorite piece of music composed for the NES. That being said, there is one thing holding the entire Zelda 2 soundtrack back for me, that being the twang all the instruments have. It almost sounds like it's trying to be quirky or whatever, and much like my voice, I just think it's an ugly sound. It doesn't take away from the amazing composition of the dungeon themes, but it does make me turn towards the Smash Bros. Remix. Now, I don't think that it's any surprise that A Link to the Past has the superior soundtrack to both of these games. The opening slowly builds up much like the previous game, however the tune that it builds up to is epic. It shows exactly what tone the adventure will have, and it's also really catchy despite being 15 seconds long. The Sanctuary theme is haunting, despite this being a safe haven. Link is technically a wanted man, and this is the only place in the world where he can find solace, and the music perfectly reflects this. The Overworld theme is more of the same from the original game, but the Dark World theme is simply amazing, and it stands as one of the best Overworld tracks in the series. The dungeon music is wonderfully atmospheric, if a little repetitive. My favorite track from the game is Triforce Chamber. After beating Ganon, having conquered every challenge the game threw at you, you get this theme that makes you feel like you truly won. The tune perfectly captures the elegance of this sacred artifact as well. I'm not the biggest fan of the staff roll in this game, but it does a decent enough job at giving the story that conclusive feeling. The control differences between these games are staggering, and you can definitely feel the improvements made when playing them all back to back. The original game's combat is really archaic, since you can only stab in front of you. This leads to a lot of awkward strafing around enemies, as well as you having to think a lot more about how you position yourself, which makes the combat in general feel overly complicated and sluggish. Other than that, the first game doesn't feel too bad to play. It's not amazing or anything, but outside of combat, everything feels perfectly decent. Zelda 2, being a side-scroller, surprisingly manages to get a far better flow with combat. Fighting enemies in close quarters is actually quite fun, as you try to hit them while minimizing the amount of damage you take. Fighting Iron Knuckles in particular is quite fun, with you jumping at their heads to slash them there. But this wouldn't work if the overall controls weren't smooth, and luckily this game is like butter. Everything regarding the controls in this game just feels good, and it is a huge step up from the previous entry. In fact, the combat is easily the best part of the game, which isn't something that I can say about any other Zelda game. And it also illustrates that it's only downhill from here. Of course, even in this game there are issues with the combat, primarily when fighting ranged enemies. It just isn't fun having to go through a swarm of projectiles just to deal some damage. It's not enough to straight up ruin everything, but it is an instance where combat isn't that much fun. The platforming feels about as good as most late NES platformers, so not much to say there. A Link to the Past has slightly worse combat than Zelda 2. The reason I feel this way is because it's overall less complex and interesting than the previous game, though that isn't to say that Zelda 2's combat is necessarily complex, it's just that it feels like there's more to combat in that game, with you having to find good strategies to defeat enemies. Here, it's as simple as slashing your sword, which at the very least feels a lot better than in the first Zelda. Positioning yourself is mostly for dodging and not attacking, so you don't need to be nearly as precise. However, with Zelda 2, the simple addition of being able to jump and crouch meant that there was far more to combat encounters, since enemies could attack you from essentially 3 different vantage points, and so you need to take all of them into account with every battle. Here though, a lot of the time there isn't that much to combat outside of just slashing your sword. Theoretically you could use your items, but the majority of the time, unless they're weak to a certain item, it's usually more efficient to just use your sword. The overall controls essentially feel like a far less clunky, more refined version of the original games. That's about all I can talk about in this section, since that's really the only thing that I would say is directly tied to the presentation for these games. On to progression. Easily the thing that changed the most between these 3 releases was how progression was handled. The first game has a completely open map, and you can explore nearly the whole world at your leisure. Certain dungeon items even allow for easier overworld exploration. The game isn't completely obtuse with its progression either, since it uses easier enemies to guide the player through earlier parts of the game. It's interesting coming back to this game after Breath of the Wild, since it could be argued that the first game is less free-flowing than it. Every dungeon is required to be beaten before you're allowed to access the final dungeon. The overworld doesn't really make it feel like the world is your oyster. It's a lot more cryptic, and it's a bit closer to something like a Metroidvania. I think that in general, a lot of people tend to over-exaggerate the cryptic nature of the game, making it seem like it would be impossible to beat the game if you don't have a guide, which couldn't be further from the truth. 9 times out of 10, you just need to commit a copious amount of trial and error, which would be annoying if the game didn't have this sense of mystery associated with it. Trying out your whole arsenal in order to see what works helps with the exploration element of the game, since you need to figure out what to do when you get to the location that you need to get to. However, it's here that we get to a bit more of a negative part of the section, since if there's one thing that the game doesn't handle that great if you ask me, it would definitely be the items. Outside of the ladder and raft, I don't really feel this sense of Link growing in power and expanding his arsenal in meaningful ways. If you manage to find the blue ring, that's a far more impactful feeling of progression in comparison to something like a more powerful boomerang or a whistle. It doesn't help that the overworld doesn't take much advantage of the items you get in dungeons. Plus, these items aren't even that great a lot of the time. You use the raft like twice, once to get to the next dungeon and a second time to get a heart piece. The step ladder is used to crop a couple of 1 tile wide gaps. The whistle is used to undo the status effect that bubbles give you in dungeons, as well as warping through the overworld. The bow is fine, I guess, but you get it so early on that I can't really think of it as a meaningful part of progression outside of the first 10 or so minutes of the game when you're making your way to the first dungeon. That's not to say that every item is like this though. I think that the most substantial feeling upgrade to your arsenal definitely comes with the Bible, also known as the Magic Book. This item makes you feel really powerful as it's a really effective weapon, being a better version of the magic wand since it upgrades the beam you shoot. Then of course we have the silver arrows, which are required to beat Ganon. And I feel that this is one of the stupider parts of this game's design. The silver arrows should make the fight easier, not the only way that it's possible. If the final fight were just more difficult, then it would make the discovery of the silver arrows feel a lot more rewarding than if you got to the end of the fight and were unable to kill Ganon. As it is in the game, it ultimately just leads to a less satisfying ending. It's not like it's the worst thing in the world, which is why I'm not making my voice sound angry here. It's more that it's a decision that I can't find any justification for. Its main use is completely arbitrary, and it also doesn't serve any use outside of the ending blow to Ganon. But if you want to talk about truly useless items, might I interest you in Zelda 2's item selection. There are hardly any moments where an item gets used in an interesting way after you use it to overcome some overworld roadblock. Not really helping with this problem is the fact that the majority of these items are only used in the overworld, which is generally pretty barren and boring to explore. The candle is a fairly mundane item, allowing you to see pitch black areas. Since you get it in the first dungeon of the game, it means that it only fundamentally changes how you approach the caves once, which is this first one you find. The hammer and raft just allow you to bypass a roadblock and are pretty quickly forgotten about afterward. Arguably the most interesting item in the game are the boots, which allow you to walk in areas that are otherwise lethal, such as the surface of lava. Somewhat making up for the lackluster items are the spells that you learn. Some are quite bad or borderline useless, particularly the spell, which is used to open a single passage, as well as turning enemies into bots, though there's never really a point in the game in which it's ever handy. And the jump spell, which is a bit too situational to ever feel important. There are some spells that are legitimately useful, however. The shield spell decreases the damage you take, the life spell, which gives you some health back, the fairy spell, which temporarily turns Link into a fairy, allowing for access into certain hallways or tunnels, the reflect spell, which, as the name would imply, reflects beams back at the enemy who fired it, and the thunder spell, which is a really effective screen nuke. Though being forced to use it to damage the final boss is quite annoying, and unlike the silver arrows, you could be in a situation where you use all of your magic and are thus in a position where it is impossible to be the final boss of the game. Another element that adds to the overall progression are the 2 attacks that you can learn, that being the downward thrust and the jump thrust, both of which allow you more attack options in combat, as well as more interesting uses in exploration. I think that the downward thrust is particularly satisfying, and it's just another layer that makes the combat so much fun in the game. This is also the game that established a proper linear string of progression. Part of this comes down to the overworld not having much incentive to explore, but since that's mostly a content issue, I'll complain about it more when we get to the next section. A Link to the Past is obviously notable for being the game that introduced the classic Zelda formula that stuck for over 20 years. I don't really feel like I have to explain how that formula works. Most items here feel legitimately useful throughout the game, and in general, I think this is definitely the one game of these first 3 where it feels like you are getting stronger as you build up your arsenal. One area of this game's progression that I'm not that big a fan of has to do with how the dungeons are handled in the Dark World portion of the game. For the first third of the game where you're in the light world, you can't do any of the dungeons out of order. Once you get to the dark world, after the first dungeon here, you can do any of the other dungeons out of order. Now you might be wondering what problem I have, and I assure you that it isn't that you can complete them in any order you see fit. I mean, Breath of the Wild is one of my favorite Zelda games. The problem here is that the incentive to do them out of order is non-existent. Here's a little thought experiment for you. If you didn't know that you could do the dungeons out of order, would you even think about doing them out of order? Probably not. The reason for this is because all the dungeons are numbered. In the first game, half the time you didn't even know if you were going into a dungeon, and if you did, then there was no way of telling which one it was until you entered. You can pretty easily do levels 1, 2, 3, or 8 in any order you see fit. The only thing truly preventing you from completing it being your own skill level. With the numbering of the dungeons in A Link to the Past, it discourages doing them out of order since you already know what order the devs wanted you to play through them, which to me at least, makes me lose a lot of the desire to do them out of order, since I already know which ones will give me trouble based on my current skill set. Another problem that arises because of this is one thing that I love about the original game, that being that you could very easily walk into an area of the map where you'll be absolutely decimated without knowing beforehand. You got to make the discovery that this area is probably not designed with your current equipment in mind, which added a nice sense of progression to the overworld that you personally got to discover. With A Link to the Past, I already know that the general area around certain dungeons will be more difficult than another one, since I already know that the devs don't want me to go there yet. And again, I position the fact that there's absolutely nothing incentivizing you to even think about going to these areas until previous challenges have been completed. So this begs the question, does non-linearity even matter if the game doesn't incentivize it? Perhaps this would be a fair question to ask if the developers were even designing the game with non-linearity in mind. Based on interviews with Miyamoto, I don't think that it would be too much of a stretch to imagine that they didn't design this game intending to implement that degree of exploration. Doing stuff out of order would be too much for the SNES to handle in regards to the story, apparently. But the story is so simple that after the opening sequence, all of the roadblocks forcing you to a specific path for the first 3 dungeons feel arbitrary. There is no real reason that the story in this game wouldn't be able to handle you doing dungeons out of order, considering that the order you receive the message from the maidens you rescue don't really need to be done in a specific order. And we know that it doesn't matter, yet the devs most certainly didn't intend for this to occur. These numbered dungeons are how they want you to go through the story, and yet you can do them out of order. This is such a massive contradiction that I can't even wrap my head around it. Zelda games have usually struggled with telling huge compelling stories and having a non-linear gameplay experience. So we end up with games like Breath of the Wild, which has a more implied story, and Skyward Sword, where a lot of the gameplay decisions almost feel like they were made with the story in mind. A Link to the Past shows the worst of both worlds, where they sacrifice exploration without telling a compelling or even linear story to compensate. The fact that this could have so easily been 100% open-ended is so upsetting because this game walks the fence so much, and yet it manages to satisfy neither side. One of the reasons that I feel so strongly about this is due to the Zelda games that are more open in their design like this not only make the potential developer-intended path less obvious, but they also give you the items in a less linear way. A Link Between Worlds and Breath of the Wild give you all the items at the start of the game, which makes you feel like the only thing stopping you from exploring certain parts of the world is your own skill and sense of curiosity. Even compared to the first game where you aren't given a bunch of items at the beginning, you only have a sword and are given absolutely 0 directions on where to go next. Whether or not you want to explore, you are forced to because the game isn't going to give you any pointers. What does exploration in A Link to the Past do that even comes anywhere close to these games? There's a general sense of direction in where you go and what you do, and you don't even feel that confident in exploring harder areas before you need to, because you always know that deep down you aren't supposed to be here yet. The long and short of it is that knowing when the devs want me to go to certain areas really discourages me from exploration, which is kind of important to me in a Zelda game. The main quests in these first 3 games are pretty hit or miss. First off, there's absolutely no side content outside of a few mini-games in A Link to the Past, which does have the unfortunate side effect of making the overworlds feel fairly barren. A common complaint levied at Breath of the Wild is how barren the overworld feels, and thinking about it while not playing, it definitely feels that way. But when actually playing the game, you notice that there are a variety of things to do that make the world feel more interesting. From the many mini-games to the different villages, environmental challenges, etc. On top of this are the many shrines that give a focused challenge, on top of the many mechanics and whatnot to mess around with. To be honest, I think that it's kind of impossible to make an open world game that doesn't feel empty in some kind of way. Skyrim and Oblivion are very similar to Breath of the Wild in that the worlds are kind of empty, but when you play them, you mostly just focus on the next immediate thing that there is to do rather than the barrenness. Yeah, my only other open world experiences thus far have been those 2 Elder Scrolls games. I know that there are probably better examples, so shut up. That got way off track, but the point is that I think it's more forgivable for these 3 games since they were being developed in a pre-3D era compared to Breath of the Wild, Skyrim, and Oblivion, which find ways to prevent the world from feeling empty or boring while playing the game. The first game's content is limited to the dungeons and a few shops with old people that you can find. For a game on the NES, this is perfectly acceptable. With the focus of the game being exploring to find your next destination, I don't even think that it's really necessary for there to be villages and such, given that it would essentially take away from the shops and secrets by pooling them all together. The overall design of the overworld is the first game's biggest strength, and even though it would have been nice to give more of a hint as to where these secrets were, because none of them are even really required to be the game, I don't see the problem. The design of the world overall is pretty dang solid as well. It's perfectly sized, not too big or too small. The dungeons are spread evenly throughout for the most part, leading to a good incentive to explore every screen of the game. Again, this is from the perspective of this being an NES game, but it is honestly kind of impressive how they managed to make an overworld that is still decently fun to explore over 30 years later. The Adventure of Link has the worst overworld in the entire series. Like I said in the previous section, there is absolutely zero incentive to explore, and that's because there's nothing to find. This game introduces villages, but they don't do anything other than obfuscate progression. The first game only locked shops and the occasional heart upgrade behind these secrets, whereas the sequel regressed this and locked mandatory progression behind it, which is a big problem. Pretty much the only things to actually find are pockets of side-scrolling sections, and the only real rewards that aren't for the main quest are lives. Which is a dumb system in its own right, since if you get a game over anywhere other than right at the very end of the game, you start at the very beginning and have to agonizingly walk all the way back to where you died so that you can hopefully make progress, assuming you didn't take too much damage or die again on your way over. And since you'll likely make so many trips on your first playthrough, you will very quickly see how little there is to do in the overworld. People love to complain about Hyrule Field and Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess, but at least there's stuff to do in there, and there are also a bunch of fast travel points that you can skip retreading boring parts if you don't feel like trying to find the secrets and can focus on purely new content. The map in the second game essentially acts as a really boring plane that connects all the different content together. It's so boring, in fact, that I have officially run out of things to say about it. To absolutely no one's surprise, A Link to the Past has the best overworld of these 3 games. Secrets are far less obtuse, there are more points of interest beyond just the dungeons, and the village is pretty based. Of course, where this game really shines is with its main concept of the light world and the dark world. The dark world is much more hostile and difficult to traverse. It also opens up the possibilities for secrets even more, since you can travel from the dark world to the light world anywhere, but can only get to the dark world using specific portals. This allows for a slight bit of navigational puzzle solving as you try to position yourself somewhere where a secret lies. One problem that I do have with the game is that the lack of more collectibles than just heart pieces makes traversing through the overworld kind of boring. Ocarina of Time had heart pieces, golden skulltulas, and Poes to find throughout the world. Twilight Princess had heart pieces, bugs, and Poes. For as dumb as I find the treasure charts to be in Wind Waker, they did give you more to look for in the dungeons and gave you an incentive to sail out to more than just the next story destination. Skyward Sword's surface design was so well crafted that it made up for the lack of meaningful exploration in the sky, and Majora's Mask focused on giving you more interesting things to do in the world rather than giving you more stuff to find, cramming its relatively small overworld full of side quests. So do you see why I say that later games make going back to this one a bit of a chore? Compounding this issue is the mere existence of A Link Between Worlds, which manages to take this game's overworld and tear it to shreds. I'll save my thoughts on its overworld when we get to that video, but for now I think that it's important to note how much lesser it feels in this game by comparison. A Link Between Worlds feels fuller, there's more stuff to do, its wall merging mechanic opens the world to have some more interesting design, the item system means that there's a bit more choice in how you explore, either focusing on one specific item you rented, or going after everything you see with a full arsenal you just acquired. Lorule, apart from having a more interesting story reason for existing, also manages to have more interesting methods of accessing it, with these mysterious glowing cracks in the wall. Going back to A Link to the Past, it feels remarkably underwhelming. Overall, I'd say that A Link to the Past overworld is about on par with Zelda 1's, with the Dark World slightly elevating it. It really wouldn't be until Link's Awakening that there would finally be an overworld in the series that I would fully enjoy. My favorite part of any Zelda game is the dungeon content, except for Breath of the Wild, where it's about on par with the overworld in terms of enjoyment. Anyway, the dungeons in these games are not that great. There's most certainly an upward trend in terms of enjoyment, and progressively less terrible design though. So, like with all my other Zelda videos, let's go through all 27 of them. The Eagle does a good job at introducing the dungeons in the game. The enemies are easy and the navigation is simple, all while being more structured than the relatively free-flowing overworld. One thing that it introduces that isn't expanded upon in future dungeons are the puzzles. It's just push block to open door and requires 0 brain power. It's almost the exact opposite of Breath of the Wild's Divine Beast, which had a massive focus on puzzles above all else, while here it's a massive focus on combat above all else. One thing that I've always found fun about the dungeons in this game is how the layout is based off of an animal or shape, which is almost certainly the direct inspiration behind the look of the Divine Beasts. Just thought that was an interesting little tidbit I've never seen anyone bring up before. The moon is larger and more expansive than the previous dungeon, which I actually think is a pretty smart way of escalating the difficulty since the puzzles and enemies are basically the exact same. Some are a bit trickier, like the ropes, which is probably the strangest name I've ever heard for any enemy in any video game ever, but overall it's just the navigation that gets a bit harder. The Manji is most remembered by a lot of people as being the dungeon that looks like that one German symbol from 1933 to 1945, despite actually being an ancient religious symbol that represented good luck and other synonyms to that prior to when those disgusting, cringe Germans turned it on its side. Anyway, this one also ups the difficulty with its more complex level design, as well as introducing the Dark Nuts, who suck all joy from my life. It introduces one of the biggest problems with the dungeons in this game, being that the game's difficulty curve is more artificial because the challenge only comes from a bunch of annoying, hard to kill enemies who can do quite a bit of damage to you being spammed all over the room with no rhyme or reason. It's not quite as bad here since they aren't as hard to kill as they will soon become, but it sure is a bad omen. The snake is unremarkable, there's really not that much to say about it, it's mostly just a mediocre and unmemorable dungeon. There's no moments of absolute stupidity, or any moments of true joy and fun either. It just exists. The lizard marks the point in the game where the dungeons become really freaking annoying. Almost all of these dungeons in the second half are incredibly frustrating and have some of the most infuriating artificial difficulty spikes I have ever seen in any video game. With that being said, this dungeon is basically the exact same situation as the previous dungeon, just longer and with more dumb enemy spam rooms, though there are only 3 that are controller break inducing. I know, a sentence worse than a non-native English speaker, but to be honest, I think it's just those 3 rooms draining all of my brain cells. I don't know, there's really not a lot else to say about this dungeon. It's mostly just the tamest in a string of annoying quote-unquote challenges. The dragon introduces the singular most annoying enemy in the entire game, the Wizrobes. I cannot stand these scumbags. Almost every single room sees them mindlessly spammed there. It is a chore to take care of. It is absolutely relentless. On top of this, progression through the dungeon is incredibly simple. It's really small, so I suppose that's why there's so many of these obnoxious jerks. If it weren't for the Wizrobes, then it would be an unmemorable and really boring dungeon. But instead, it's frustrating and I risk breaking my controller every time I revisit it. Shockingly enough, the Demon is the best dungeon in the game. It's not even a competition. It's large and expansive with several optional rooms that serve to make the central path more confusing. There aren't as many rooms that are merely enemy spam. Dare I say it's actually kind of fun. It isn't as complex or interesting as the dungeons from later entries, but for this game it is far and away the gold standard of what they should have been like. Not much else to say, just a shockingly decent time. The lion is exactly the same as the dragon, except it's bigger, which makes progression slightly more fun. The main enemy spam here isn't Wizrobes, thank the heavens, but rather Darknuts, who are annoying but nowhere near as aggravating as the Wizrobes. Honestly, saying anything else would just have me repeating myself too much, so let's move on. I'm conflicted on Death Mountain. On the one hand, I love how gargantuan it is. It's massive and there are quite a few different paths that you can take. As long as you get the silver arrow, it's fairly lax in how you progress in comparison to the rest of the dungeons. It's all about how you get to the final boss room, meaning that it acts as a final test of your progression throughout the game. The only real problem that I have with the progression is that you get the map a little too late in the dungeon, but otherwise I think that in terms of progression, it's actually fairly solid. Notice how I keep using that specific word to describe it though, because outside of that, it suffers pretty hard from some of the same problems the rest of the dungeons have. More rooms means more mindless enemy spam, which means very likely more restarts. I honestly don't know if I like it or not because it has good and bad elements. I suppose if they were to remake the game and make the enemies less annoying, I would probably really enjoy it. But alas, unless that happens, I'll never know for sure. I don't really have much to say about the dungeons in Zelda 2, mostly because of how they're all designed. 2D side-scrolling just doesn't lead to many opportunities for memorable dungeon experiences. A lot of them are only about as fun as the combat lets them be since it's just running down different corridors. Parappa Palace does a good job getting you used to the basics, but it doesn't do much outside of that. Midoro Palace spices it up a little bit by offering a lower floor. The Island Palace meets up the bones of Midoro with a little bit more snaking through it involved. The Maze Palace offers an even meatier experience and is the most fun dungeon thus far in the game. The Ocean Palace turns this up a notch with even more snaking through it and a few other splintering pathways. It's probably the most fun dungeon in the game. The Hidden Palace doesn't have as many paths, but otherwise it's basically more of the same. The Great Palace is in the exact same boat as Zelda 1's final dungeon. It's the most fun from a design perspective, but the enemies are obnoxiously hard even with maxed out stats. That is seriously all I have to say on them. They're fun in the moment, but I can't really say if they're well designed or not because of how little they stick out. The only memorable part of them is the combat, and that definitely isn't exclusive to the dungeons, so they don't take up a lot of space in my memory. The dungeons in A Link to the Past introduced the dungeon format that would stick until Breath of the Wild finally broke that trend. However, while they did a good job introducing it, I don't think any of the ones in this game are particularly special. The Eastern Palace is a fine first dungeon. It's always pretty obvious where to go next. It's basically a straight line that's forcefully curved at some points. But that's fine because it's what I expect out of a first dungeon. There's not a whole lot else to say about it. The Desert Palace isn't much better than the last dungeon. It's pretty easy and the only thing it has going for it is splitting the first and second halves of the dungeon in the overworld. But the only thing that they actually do with that concept is hide a piece of heart down a screen, which makes me wonder why they even bothered splitting it in two anyway, since it doesn't add much to the overall progression through the dungeon itself. The Tower of Hera is the first legitimately good dungeon in the game. It introduces orange and blue blocks that shift up and down based on whether the crystal switch is red or blue, and while it would be used in much better ways in later dungeons, they're still well used here. The only negative I can think of is getting to the big chest. You have to fall through a whole floor above, but if you go through the lower part, you'll land on these star panel things and have to climb to the next floor to fall through the top, which feels like a massive waste of time for such a small mistake. The Dark Palace is what really kills the momentum of the game for me. It isn't bad, it's just really boring. Whenever I get here, the strategy I use is to basically just go around in a circle a few times, which makes the dungeon feel a lot more constrictive. I know I could probably use a different route, but that would make the whole thing last longer than I'd like. It also doesn't really have any decent puzzles, so it's just a half hour of blandness. The Swamp Palace is the one that comes the closest to being a dungeon from Zelda 1. There's just some mindless enemy spam in some rooms, particularly in the central room. It's kinda ridiculous. The puzzles aren't really that much of a pain if you know what you're doing, and there are so many optional rooms that it does a decent job at hiding the overall linear progression of the dungeon. Skull Woods has an interesting idea of having multiple dungeon entrances hidden throughout the forest, but the execution is kind of lame. They don't hide any important item or key out in the overworld, which almost makes it feel like they implemented it just for the sake of the idea, without giving any thought into actually designing the dungeon around the woods. And just in case you think that I'm nitpicking, first of all, yes, I probably am, but also this is also an issue that I have with it in A Link Between Worlds, so it's a reasonable complaint if I dislike it in both instances. There's also only 3 entrances that you need to find to beat the dungeon, which makes it feel like 3 disconnected mini dungeons rather than one full interconnected experience. Gargoyle's Domain is fun, I guess. I like the opening section because it's confusing to navigate, but after that it's a straight shot. The enemies aren't that annoying, and I really like the take on the boss being a disguised hostage. Outside of that, however, it doesn't really have anything interesting to offer. The Ice Palace is the best dungeon in the game. It does have some shortcomings though, like some of the most annoying ice physics in any game I've ever played, but it's really solid otherwise. It's relatively straightforward, the enemies aren't too irritating, and the final puzzle is brilliant and is what elevates it to the best dungeon status, with you having to think about what route through the dungeon you need to take to push this block down the hole. I love stuff like this. Navigational puzzle solving is my absolute favorite thing that any Zelda game does. I mean, you could also use the Cane of Samaria to solve it in like 2 seconds, but that's a positive in my book because it means that if you already beat Misery Mire, you don't have to do this final challenge, which only further adds to my frustrations to numbering all the dungeons, but I've already whined about that enough. Misery Mire is fun to run through, but there isn't anything of substance to it. There isn't anything to praise or anything to critique, it's all just a tiny dot in my memory compared to the rest of the game. Kinda like the rest of the dungeons, but I digress. Turtle Rock is a good penultimate dungeon. The pipes are a bit confusing, but it's not too bad. It has you needing to pay attention to where you'll end up and make a mental note of how it affects the progression of the dungeon. I like the moving platforms, except in this piece of trash room. I swear I'll be holding down a direction on the D-pad, but the game will just not respond, and it really angers me. Anyway, fine experience, kicks off the Turtle Rock trend right. Ganon's Tower is mostly just a gauntlet. It's a good ramp up to the final boss, and of the 3 games talked about in this video, it is absolutely the best final dungeon of the lot. Not like that was a high bar to clear, but it's still an accomplishment nonetheless. It puts your skills to the test with a few mini bosses and a lot of combat encounters that don't make me want to rip my hair out. Not much else to it. The bosses in Zelda games have never really been the strong suit. In fact, prior to Breath of the Wild, I think that they've always been hit or miss, with the hits really hitting and the misses really missing. And the majority of the bosses from these first 3 games fall into the latter camp. Aquamentus is pathetically easy. He just shoots fireballs and you just have to avoid them and then stab him. For a first boss, he's fine, but then they brought him in to be the final boss of the 7th dungeon without changing him at all. It's embarrassing. The Dodongo is also pathetically easy, not even really attacking Link and only asking you to place a bomb in its path. Manhandla is surprisingly enough easy to fight. This one actually can be fun though, with you having to avoid its attacks and then attacking it. But since it actually moves, it's more stimulating than the others. Gleeok feels like a harder version of Aquamentus, though it's still not that hard or fun. Dig Dogger has you using the recorder against it, which then splits it into a mini Dig Dogger that is 2 stabs of a sword away from death. Too basic to be entertaining. Gom is pathetically easy, just shoot him in the eye and he will instantly die. They do show up later and take 3 shots instead of 1, and those ones are a little more fun, but not by much. We'll get into Ganon and the other final bosses and discuss them at the same time later. Now, credit where it's due, I think that another one of Zelda 2's shocking strengths is that its boss fights are actually surprisingly fun. None of them are amazing or anything, but with how enjoyable combat is, I think that it ultimately makes for a selection of fun, if samey bosses. Mazura utilizes the fun combat found in the game quite well, surprisingly enough. The only point that you can damage him is to attack his head, so you have to perform a jump attack at his head in order to damage him, and it's a fun fight. Wow, that was a bad sentence. That was very repetitive and cringe. I'm sorry about that. Germa Fencer is exactly the same. You just need to jump and hit his head, except this time it will add another floating head whenever you damage it. Crazy. I was today years old when I learned that this Iron Knuckle's name was Rebonak. Crazy. This boss is also quite fun and you have to use the downward thrust while avoiding all of his attacks. Helps that he's difficult without feeling as overly cheap as the game sometimes is. It's a little disappointing that he just becomes a regular Iron Knuckle once he dismounts, but otherwise I actually enjoy this fight. Karok is a really cool design in the official artwork, like dang that's epic. He also acts as a way to teach you about the precursor to the final boss of the game, with you having to crouch in the corner to reflect these attacks back at him. Kinda boring, moving on. Guma is a bit of a repetitive fight and he can do some massive amounts of damage if you aren't careful. That being said, I actually think that he's a fun boss. If it was a little more forgiving, I'd probably enjoy it a lot more. Barba is annoying to fight on top of once again going for the whole head is the weak point shtick, and by this point in the game it gets a little stale. A Link to the Past bosses definitely fluctuate the most between each of them. Some are really fun, some are not, and the rest fall into the middle pool of mediocrity. The Armos Knights don't really pose that much of a challenge, just shoot them with the bow 3 times. The last knight is trickier to hit, but again, it's not that big of a challenge. Granted, it is the first boss in the game, so I can't be too hard on it. The Land Mola is more irritating than anything else. They never stop moving and you have to hit their heads, so generally the fight drags out for an uncomfortable amount of time. Moldorm is only notable in that he's annoying to fight. It's really easy to get knocked off the platform. Otherwise, there's not much to him. Remember when I said that some of the bosses in the game were actually fun? Well, Aghanim is fun. While he's easy, it's not that big of an issue for me. Energy Tennis feels a lot better in a 2D setting compared to a 3D setting if you ask me, and it feels pretty good here. The Helmasaur King is fine. Hitting him can be kind of finicky, so I always end up losing a bunch of heart, but he's fine otherwise. Argus is another good boss. I like how you always have to be on the move. The fight is engaging and fun. Mothula is probably my favorite boss in the game, with you having to avoid the spikes in his attacks, making for a really satisfying and challenging fight. Blind is stupidly easy with the Cane of Birna, which serves him right for having a stupid name. Goldstare is also pathetically easy, with you being able to completely skip the first phase with bombs, and the Fire Rod absolutely massacring him in the second phase. Vitreous is also easy. His lightning attack can never hit you, which makes him pose zero threat. Trinix is yet another decent boss. I like how it utilizes the fire and ice rods. Not much to him otherwise, but still a fun boss. Now onto the final bosses. If there's one thing that Zelda gets consistently right, it's the final bosses. They're usually wonderfully atmospheric, offer a fantastic one-on-one sword duel, or otherwise a really cool visual. Even games that I'm not the biggest fan of, like the Wind Waker or Minish Cap, have amazing final battles. However, these 3 don't really have that. They're kinda archaic and a bit of a chore to fight. Take the OG Ganon. He's invisible for most of the fight, with you having to follow his projectiles in order to damage him. On paper, this is actually a decent idea, but it only really works if there's more visual information dedicated to actually figuring out where he is, especially since he teleports around the room. The best strategy is to just camp in the corner and wait for him to show up there. It isn't interesting, and the only challenge comes from something that the game artificially adds to make the fight less stale. It's a really weak ending. Thunderbird and Link Shadow offer a 1-2 punch combo of badness. They are easily the worst bosses in the game, both for wildly differing reasons. Thunderbird is straight up unfair, flying around the room while continuously and haphazardly dropping a bunch of projectiles non-stop, with you having to hit the weak point, which is its head. On top of that, in order to even be able to defeat it, you need to use the Thunder Spell, which is easily the dumbest thing any Zelda game has ever had to pull. I already talked about it earlier though, so there's no point in repeating myself. I don't understand why it's like this. It's so unbelievably arbitrary, and just because the person playing the game and the footage that I'm using is a pro gamer and doesn't take damage, doesn't mean that I'm that based, so shut up. Shadow Link is a cool concept for a boss, which is why it's such a shame that Zelda never seems to get it right. You literally just go to the corner and then get a bunch of quick stabs in. While you could do it the dev intended way, after going through the absolute nightmare of the previous boss, it's a lot better to just play it safe. It acts as a good breather, but for the final fight of the game, it's a bit of a disappointment. Especially with how great the combat is, I think that a duel the dark version of yourself who has the same abilities is actually a pretty cool way to end the game. What a shame. While A Link to the Past's final fight isn't as bad as the previous two games, it's still not great. The rematch with Aghanim is basically the same as your previous encounter, not much else to say. Ganon's first phase is really easy, with you avoiding the easily dodgeable trident and then attacking him after he teleports to catch it. Phase 2 is just a slightly harder version of phase 1, with him sending out projectiles, but phase 3 is when I start getting annoyed. The only real difference is that the ground collapses and the projectiles are directed towards Link. This wouldn't be a problem if it wasn't for knockback, causing you to fall down the hole and restart the entire battle, because the Lord hath forbidden that they put a spawn point in the fight like literally every other time you fall down a pit in the game. Phase 4 is just straight up awful. You have to light the 2 torches and then hit Ganon with your sword and then shoot him with your silver arrows. His attacks never change, he never even poses that much of a threat, it's just back and forth doing the same menial task. Overall, the dungeons and bosses leave something to be desired. They lay the foundation, but later games would use that foundation as a springboard to create some truly fantastic puzzlers and engaging fights. Which leads us to the conclusion. It isn't my goal to just be a contrarian for the sake of it. I feel like only terminally online people do that in an attempt to get a rise out of people, and it was never my intention to do that. I just wanted to share my perspective on a game that I don't have a strong affinity for. These 3 games are the single most important games in the series, and I would be stupid and ignorant to say otherwise. But much like a lot of series that I adore, like Mario and Sonic, the earlier games built the foundation that future games would build more off of, and it makes me appreciate the older games, but I don't like them as much as later entries. But as I said earlier, this video is subjective and in no way is meant to reflect some objective truth. If any of these are your favorite Zelda game, then more power to you. I think that it's fascinating seeing the different opinions surrounding games that I love that others dislike, and games that I don't care for too much that others would consider a masterpiece. And as long as you can respect that I wouldn't put any of these higher than a C tier, then I will respect you putting them in S+ tier. And at the end of the day, that's the point of having an opinion.